So last week I was in Colombia talking about no self, but 2 weeks ago we explored a little bit with the Tao Te Ching connection between Zen and Taoism. And as I was looking through the autobiography of Alan Watts, the famous Zen teacher from last century, for a reason I'll explain in a moment, I came across a statement. He says in there that according to D.T. Suzuki, who was the first great pioneer for Japan and American Zen in the 40s and 50s, Thomas Merton knew, he said Zen is Taoism. So I remember I boldly asserted that I thought without Taoism, Buddhism would never become Zen, so maybe I'm in good company asserting that. Anyway, and just today at the gym a few hours ago, there was a young Hispanic man with that symbol, the Taoist symbol, tattooed on his chest. So I guess it's current. And he had a rosary and a cross tattooed in the middle, and then a star on the other side. So we're again in good company in terms of interfaith. But the point we were making, remember, about the Taoist symbol is that is the fundamental, at least as was interpreted in Zen, the fundamental doctrine of Mahayana and Zen in general is that emptiness is form and form is emptiness. The absolute and the relative are right here together, non-dual. Symbol of the white and the black intermingling, forming one circle, and then within the white the black, and within the black the white. So absolute and relative perfectly conjoined. So today, what I'd like to do is show how T.S. Eliot is a Zen master, which you probably already could have guessed if you're familiar with some of his poetry. But what prompted me to do this is a card from a mailing from a holy card from a mailing by Richard Rohr with a flame on the front, and in the back it's the quote we're going to explore today from T.S. Eliot, The Four Quartets, which so struck me that I said, wow, I mean, this guy knows what he's talking about, not just in terms of his own experience, but in terms of his exposure to the tradition. So we're going to start with the very last lines, as it turns out. I didn't realize that until I got the poetry in hand. The very last lines of the Four Quartets. Now, according to I'm not a scholar of T.S. Eliot, so if anybody here today or listening later online has any commentary, please chime in at the end. But according to one is Eliot's scholar, this was the last work, the last poetry of T.S. Eliot. So in other words, these lines are the last thing he ever wrote. Kind of like, reminds me of Thomas Aquinas, who had his mystical experience and then said, okay, that's enough of this, no more of this dumb theology. All that I wrote is straw, and so he didn't even finish his Summa. But this is obviously the work of a mystic or an aspiring mystic, and I guess once he said this, he said the same thing as St. Thomas, and words aren't adequate anymore. So anyway, what's really struck me, the very last three lines, speaking about the final consummation of everything, when the tongues of flame are enfolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. Now that might seem like what is he talking about? Let's repeat that. When the tongues of flame are enfolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. Now I had a suspicion, he's quoting a lot of authors, which we'll see in a minute, throughout this the quartets, but I had a suspicion he was inspired by Dante here. So I went back to the last canto of the Paradiso this morning, and sure enough, there's the image. If you've read Dante, you know that the final image of paradise is a rose. And I don't think Dante invented that, as we'll see in a second. But the idea is there's like the heavenly court is like a rose with many petals, more and more close to the center, petals stretching outward. And lo and behold, right in those last lines, there's the word not, K-N-O-T, the same word nodo in Italian. So there's another indication that he might have gotten it precisely from there. And talking about the light and the fire, of the heavenly light, surrounding or entering into the rose. So you can take the rose as a symbol of the relative, of the flower of all creation, as we would call it, the various petals working together and around a center point. Now Alan Watts, this is what I was looking for in his book this morning, has a whole section on the rose as a mystical symbol, and he points out the sexual aspect of it in terms of it's receptive. A flower is receptive, trying to attract the bees, and although most flowering plants have both the stamen and the pistil, the male and female in the one flower, some don't. In any case, it's this receptive symbol, so like all of the relative, receptive to the absolute. The greatest confirmation of this, where the fire and the rose are one, is a medieval cathedral. This is why I don't think Dante invented the image, because you talk about even then of a rose window, right? I was at Chartres a few months ago, and a couple of months ago, and then I saw this again for myself. And this antedates Dante by 1 or 2 centuries. So you have the huge rose window, and you have the same idea. There's petals coming up, and this is the heavenly court in most cases. You have the angels, the apostles, all different saints. There's the petals of the rose, closer or further apart from the center point. And what happens? It's a stained glass window. It's not just a mosaic on the floor. It's against the light. So the whole spirituality and theology of a rose window is that the whole of creation in its final dance, in its final flowering, is receptive to the light, the divine light which is pouring through it. The colors are magnificent, and it becomes pure light. So a rose window is Zen metaphysics. It's saying the absolute and the relative are one. The light and the rose are indistinguishable, which is the last line of his poem. The fire and the rose are one. This is fantastic. It's right there and we didn't even know it. And into the crowned knot of fire, and this is esoteric. This is what the Masons who built this cathedrals later became the Masons, the Freemasons, and this the Rosicrucians and all this other. But the doctrine really is that in terms of the human person as the temple, ourselves as the cathedral, of course the Zen as well. The crown is where the light comes in. Our crown, that's why it's a crowned knot, and the knot, is the pearl or that center of consciousness, or center of the chakra, of the crown chakra, for example. And what is the chakra? It's a circle of energy which has many petals. Speak about the petals of the various chakras, 960 or 12 or 16, or various numbers of petals. And of course in the East it's not a rose, but what? A lotus. So you have the lotus, which gradually opens up like a flower, which is the way my yoga teacher described, an enlightened person with the chakras opening up like a rose, like a petal to receive the light and the fire, which comes down in the knot. He speaks about the incarnate soul as being like where the Holy Spirit comes down in tongues of fire, So, what does he say? The tongues of flame are enfolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. Who knew that T.S. Eliot was a Christian Hermeticist, as well as a Zen teacher? But it's unmistakable. You don't talk that language unless you know what you're talking about. And then after that, you're silent, because you have nothing else to say, except to experience that. One of the Franciscan iconographers gave an exhibition here last summer. One of his icons is a head of Christ with a lotus underneath. So we're integrating this kind of imagery, into our own tradition as well. So this is the most fantastic part of it, I think, which I wanted to share. But there are a couple other things as well. Speaking of the preceding lines are the famous lines from Julian of Norwich. If you know the poem, you know this. All shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. In other words, everything's okay. Any mystic will tell you that. No matter how much you suffer, what you have to go through, it's all ultimately okay. Whether you talk about that in personal terms of divine love and divine providence, or as the Buddhist masters like Bernie Glassman and others, they still say the same thing. No matter what happens in the world, no matter how horrible it is, it's still basically okay. And you can't know that unless you're enlightened, unless you're a mystic. It doesn't mean those things don't exist or they're not important, but it just means that in the bigger picture, somehow it's okay. Anyway, that's what Julian of Norwich said in the 14th century, the famous lines. And she had no reason to be optimistic. She had her visions of this in 1373. 25 years after the Black Death ravaged a quarter or a third of Europe, during the 100 Years' War between her country and France, during what scientists call a little ice age when Europe was freezing for decades at a time. So, no Pollyanna about it here. And this is quoted again earlier where it says, "Sin is behovely, but all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well." Sin is behovely is a very famous line from her, which means even sin works into the whole picture. Happy fault, as we chant in the Easter Vigil. And that's what she's saying. Sin is actually good because it makes the whole thing work somehow. And that's what the Zen masters say too. So that's another way in which all these people agree. Another way, famous line, a few lines above that, and everybody knows this line, right? Tell me if you don't. "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." And Zen is clear about that. We start from here and we wind up here, and if we finally wake up to what we have here, we know it for the first time, even though it's always been there. Our beginning is our end, and our end is our beginning. That's a medieval French verse, by the way. Mon commencement est ma fin est commencement. And he's quoting it all over the place here. Previous stanzas. What we call the beginning is often the end. And to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. And we start from here and we end up here. The Alpha and the Omega, Christ, is here. And it does come up, again, East Coker, the second has, in the beginning, the first line is, "In the beginning is my end." And a few lines later he repeats that, "In my beginning is my end." And the last line of this quartet is, "In my end is my beginning." You just know it for the first time. In other words, what we're looking for is always here from the beginning. Zen is very strong on that, and we should, as Christians, should be stronger in saying that as well. The very first line of the first quartet. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, which is the truth, eternal now, all time is unredeemable. That's interesting. What does he mean? Well, if you stay in time, you're stuck and you're not redeemed. You've got to go into the eternal now, which is right now, which is what Zen is always saying. Everything is right here and now. The eternal now. Eckhart Tolle as well. So you can't redeem time because time is an illusion. You've got to just go beyond it into waking up into the fullness of things right now. What might have been and what has been point to one end which is always present. Footfalls echo in the memory down the passage which we did not take. We're stuck in our memory. Towards the door we never opened, into the rose garden. Exactly. You need to be brought down the primrose path if we're going to really get that. And then the famous line, at the still point of the turning world. Still Point is the name of a book on Zen by an American Jesuit who taught in Japan. At the still point of the turning world, neither flesh nor fleshless, body or spirit, don't make the distinction anymore, neither from nor towards, no dualities anymore. At the still point, there the dance is. Right? The dance of the rose, the whirling around that center point. At the still point is the dance. So movement and rest, same thing. Neither arrest nor movement, he says. And do not call it fixity, where past and future are gathered. Neither movement from nor towards, neither ascent nor decline, except for the point, the still point, there would be no dance, and there is only the dance, he says. So there's that dance around that center point, that knot of creation with chakra spinning, the heavenly hosts around that in the rose. The inner freedom, without a new world and the old made explicit, understood in the completion of its partial ecstasy, the resolution of its partial horror. Okay? Yet the enchantment of past and future, woven in the weakness of the changing body, protects mankind from heaven and damnation, which flesh cannot endure. In other words, as long as you're stuck in the changing, you're a little scared to go beyond into either extreme. Time past and time future allow but a little consciousness. Exactly, as Zen always says. To be conscious is not to be in time. Exactly. If you wake up, you're out of time.
Humankind cannot bear very much reality.
Beyond time.
You don't want to wake up, really. All that fire and light and all that stuff is a little scary. Which is another thing he says in the last, towards the end of the poem he started with. Now here he actually uses Pentecost imagery. The dove descending breaks the air with flame of incandescent terror, of which the tongues declare, the one discharged from sin and error. It's the only way. The only hope, or else despair, lies in the choice of pyre or pyre, P-Y-R-E, of pyre or pyre, to be redeemed from fire by fire. You're going to be burned one way or another, so choose your fire. And as he goes on to say, who then devised the torment? Love! It's all about love. It moves the stars and all. The sun and all the stars, as Dante says, the last line of the Divine Comedy. Compassion in Buddhism. Love is the unfamiliar name behind the hands that wove the intolerable shirt of flame. We only live, only suspire, consumed by either fire or fire. There it is again. There's actually a Stravinsky piece that uses this, so I don't know who inspired whom here, but it's either fire or fire. And finally, just some quick indications of what we are freed from if we do this. Listen to what he says on the previous stanza. There are three conditions which often look alike yet differ completely. They flourish in the same hedgerow. Attachment to self and to things and to persons. Detachment from self and from things and from persons. And growing between them, indifference. which resembles the others as death resembles life, being between two lives. So indifference is not what we're looking for. Apathy, no mystical tradition says that. Okay, let's be clear, including Buddhism. So liberation, not less of love, but expanding of love beyond desire. And so liberation from the future as well as the past. So he speaks about love of country, which has to be purified, etc. Be renewed, transfigured in another pattern, he says. Or, as he says a few verses later, about politicians, for example, those men and those who opposed them and those whom they opposed accept the constitution of silence and are folded into a single party in the end, where no opinions matter anymore. These men and those who opposed them and those whom they opposed accept the constitution of silence and are folded in a single party. Take that, Donald Trump. And finally, the famous verses from John of the Cross, which also express this kind of purification. And these are from St. John of the Cross, famously quoted here in the middle of the poem. Shall I say it again, he asks. In order to arrive there, where the knotted flame and the rose are one, to arrive where you are, beginning is the end is the beginning. To arrive where you are, to get from where you are not yet consciously, you must go by a way wherein there is no ecstasy, no ego experience you can latch onto. In order to arrive at what you do not know, you must go by a way which is the way of ignorance. So let go of all your thoughts, all your concepts, as Zen would say, but Christianity as well. This is John of the Cross, and this is a direct quote. In order to possess what you do not possess, you must go by the way of dispossession. So no clinging, no grasping, as Zen would say. No greed. In order to arrive at what you are not, or what you are not consciously, you must go through the way in which you are not. No more ego. Lose your life and gain it. And what you do not know is the only thing you know. And what you own is what you do not own. What you have is what you do not possess. It's this. You can't possess it, but you are it. And where you are is where you are not. Where you truly are is where you as ego are not. So do you think he's a mystic? I don't think he knew he didn't have anything else to say after this. The fire and the rose